Jacob Burton here from the Stella Culinary School podcast, found online at stellaculinary.com. And in today's video, we're going to discuss how to garnish food and sort of take an overview of the concept of adding garnishes to any given plate or dish. And this video was actually inspired by a question that I received on our latest video, which was our composed cauliflower soup video. And user NVJ944 asks, when doing this pour-in presentation, what's the trick to the garnishes? Are there some that work better than others? Also, the sliced cauliflower doesn't float, right? So you need to use a wide, shallow bowl, otherwise the soup would cover up your beautiful presentation. Well, I'm going to address the second half of that question first in regards to the cauliflower floating and, more importantly, covering up the garnishes. So the whole fun of actually producing or serving a composed soup like the cauliflower soup is the fact that no matter what you do, at some point that composition is going to be ruined by pouring the soup over the top of the garnishes. So part of the drama in serving a composed soup is plating your garnishes and plating your other dry ingredients into the bowl, presenting that bowl to the guest, and then pouring the soup over those garnishes, tableside in front of the guests, and adds a bit of a dramatic appeal to the dish and to the presentation of the dish. But when choosing garnishes in general, and this is what this video is meant to focus on, is when creating a dish and you're thinking about choosing garnishes, you need to you might be asking yourself, well, how do I go about choosing a garnishes, and what garnishes are appropriate? So there is a simple starting point where you must always start out, and that is asking yourself one question. What is the primary focus of your dish? So in the case of the cauliflower soup, well, yeah, the cauliflower soup is the primary focus. The cauliflower puree that we made is the primary focus. When people order this off of my menu, they're ordering cauliflower soup. So it doesn't really matter what sort of other foo-foo garnishes I put on the plate or what cool techniques I use to serve it. If the cauliflower soup base isn't highlighted and showcased, then the person who orders it is going to be disappointed because they ordered cauliflower soup and that's what they wanted. So to highlight this primary ingredient, you then need to ask yourself, well, how can I enhance my primary ingredient? And there's two ways to enhance your primary ingredient, and both are important in a completed presented dish. The first is complementary flavors. And so in this example, the complementary flavors that I chose to enhance my primary ingredient, being my cauliflower soup base, was the seared cauliflower, some basil in the form of basil oil, togarashi, which is a Japanese 7-spice, mosh, which is also commonly known as lamb's lettuce. It's a nice, fresh, tender green, and snapdragon petals. Now, the other approach that you need to think about or take into consideration is also contrasting textures, and contrasting textures are extremely important. So you want to make sure that your dish has a mixture of textures like smooth, brittle, crunchy, chewy, meaty, because take the example again of the cauliflower soup puree. Now, if made properly and strained and seasoned and all that good stuff, the first couple of sips are going to be fantastic. And oh, this is really good. But when you're eating a portion of it, when you're eating a bowl full of cauliflower soup, after the first couple of spoonfuls, you're going to get bored with it. You're going to have palate fatigue. That's because that puree becomes extremely one-dimensional over time because it has no contrasting elements, no contrasting flavors, and more importantly, no contrasting textures. So after the first couple of bites, it's just going to be smooth soup after smooth soup after smooth soup. And it's going to get real boring, right? So you enhance this by choosing garnishes that are both complementary in flavor and also add a nice textural element to the dish. So how do you actually choose complementary flavors? Well, besides just experience and trial and error, a really good resource that I enjoy for inspiration is the Flavor Bible. And you basically look up an ingredient, it's alphabetized, and then it will list other ingredients that go good with that ingredient. So in this case, I would actually look up in the Flavor Bible cauliflower, and I would have a list of ingredients to choose from. And so it's a helpful resource when you have a little bit of writer's block when coming up with a new dish. So let's go through our garnishes and talk about them one by one and why I chose to use them for this dish in hopes that it'll give you a little bit of a broader perspective of how you would choose a garnish for any given dish that you would create. So first we have basil, and basil and cauliflower are a very classic flavor pairing, and I chose to apply the flavor of the basil in the sense of an oil because I think the oil has a nice color to it, it has a nice dramatic appeal, and it allows me to add the basil flavor without necessarily the texture of chopped basil, which will start to float around in your soup, or a whole basil leaves, which is just going to wilt and turn brown. So the application of the basil oil helps me to serve that flavor in a different form. Now also it's going to add a little bit of richness to the dish, but there's no contrasting texture. It's not like basil oil is going to contrast nicely with a pureed soup. So I'm definitely going to need some other textural elements. I can't just garnish the soup with basil oil and call the dish complete. But the green color contrast does contrast nicely with the whiteness of the cauliflower soup puree. So it does add a nice visual element as well as decent flavor structure. Now, the second element is the seared cauliflower. And I like this because, roasted cauliflower just has an amazing flavor and aroma to it, but also, too, you're taking that primary ingredient and you're serving it in a different form as a contrasting texture. So it helps to give a little bit more depth of flavor. The whole point behind the soup is to highlight the cauliflower, right? And the cauliflower puree. So serving a piece of cauliflower in a different form and allowing it to contrast texturally and also visually and flavor-wise is going to just give more like a cauliflower depth to the overall dish itself. And the caramelized cauliflower has a nice sort of a chewy, almost meatiness to it. And so this is going, again, to add a nice textural element and textural contrast to the puree. Now we also have our mosh, which is commonly known as lamb's lettuce. It's a tender green available in the early spring into summertime. And it adds a nice sort of freshness to the dish and also a slight textural crunch. And I like serving it raw like this because what happens is when you pour the hot soup over the mosh, it's going to wilt slightly, but it's not going to lose its texture and it's not going to lose its fresh flavor versus if you actually threw a handful of this into the soup while you were boiling it or reheating it, it's going to completely wilt and lose its fresh flavor and fresh texture. So this allows you to serve the cauliflower soup with a nice fresh contrast without it being completely wilted and cooked out. Now also we have the togarashi, which is a Japanese 7-spice, which has a really complex flavor to it and has a nice little kick to it as well. And when you take into consideration how fat will coat your palate, and there's a decent amount of fat in the actual cauliflower puree itself, both with the butter that we use to mount it. There's also a little bit of cream in the puree, a little bit of butter, and what happens is fat will add a nice richness of flavor and richness of mouthfeel to any given dish, but it will also coat the palate and deaden other flavors. Now, one of the good ways to cut through that, besides adding a couple of drops of acid, whether it's lemon juice or any sort of vinegar of your choice, is a little heat, a little bit of a kick. And so here I sprinkle on just enough togarashi, not to necessarily make the soup spicy, but to add enough back hint of heat to help cut through the inherent richness of the fat that's contained within the cauliflower puree. Now, the final element is the snapdragon, which is just a purple flower petal that we have here. And besides the colorful contrast that it adds to the other garnishes, it adds a nice complexity of flavor and a floral element. And having a nice little floral note with some dishes, especially dishes that are vegetable-based, can really add an amazing complexity of aroma and taste to a dish, but also it's very easy to overdo it. So you'll notice I only add 3 small little petals because I want little pockets of flavor throughout the dish. I don't want every single bite to contain a flower petal. I don't want every single bite to contain a piece of mosh. That'd become overbearing. So what I do is I add these in a little random order and try and add them in small elements to where they have little pockets of flavor. And you'll also notice that I plated in 3s. So there's 3 little components on the plate and a little trick for plating is odds are always going to be more beautiful than even. So, you want to plate in ones, threes, fives, not necessarily twos or fours. Now, when choosing a garnish, there are 3 rules to garnishing food that you always want to follow. Number 1 is garnishes should always be functional. If you can't eat it, it doesn't belong on the plate. Now, there are a few exceptions to things like skewers and specialty utensils that serve a purpose, but for the most part, if your garnish isn't edible, it doesn't belong on the plate. Number 2 is garnishes should always enhance the primary ingredient. It doesn't matter what cool technique I'm using or what cool ingredient I have. If the garnish doesn't enhance the flavor of your primary ingredient, then it doesn't belong on the plate. Now, number 3 is garnishes should always add contrasting colors, textures, and overall interest and appeal to the plate. And if too many components on a single plate share the same color tone, then your plate will look flat. So you always want to try and use garnishes with contrasting colors that don't break the first 2 rules. Now, for more information, you can actually check out our this video on how to make our cauliflower soup base, also our video on how to make basil oil, and then watch the video that was the precursor to this one, our composed cauliflower soup, which actually takes you through and shows you how to plate our cauliflower soup. And as always, you can subscribe to Stella Culinary on YouTube to make sure that you never miss any of our free educational videos.